The nettle soup that I serve on the tasting menu has more to it than you might initially imagine from the name. It's a dish that takes influences from two different culinary worlds, using techniques from Japan and ingredients like seaweeds and misos, but it still has its roots in a really traditional British recipe. I'll show you how to forage and prepare the nettles and the other techniques in a moment, but first I want to give you just a little bit of background on the dish. Like a lot of my food, it's focused on and inspired by nature and the fantastic, plentiful wild ingredients that I want to showcase at their best and do something delicious and interesting with. Another good example of this are the dandelion petal fruit pastels that I serve at the start of the tasting menu. And with the nettle soup, the extra sort of interesting element of the dish comes at the table side, where I finish it with some pine smoked cream that's frozen and crushed in liquid nitrogen before being sprinkled over the soup in front of the guests at the last moment. So the history of eating nettles in a soup or stew goes back to at least the Bronze Age in the UK. They would have been a great thing to eat because they're plentiful and, like lots of leafy greens, they've got really good nutritional value, they're full of vitamins and things like calcium and iron. But nettles also have this less well-known property of synergistically boosting the perception of umami in food. This is because nettles are rich in phenolic compounds, and I was taught about this by the fantastic wild food expert Miles Irving. You might know his book, The Forager's Handbook, but if you don't, you should definitely pick this up if you're interested in foraging and wild food at all. This synergy effect with umami-rich ingredients means that when you use nettles alongside ingredients like mushrooms, or in this case seaweeds and misos, they're going to further augment and elevate that sensation of savoury deliciousness. So if we're smart about this, we can use this idea to make some extremely delicious and Moorish foods, and here I'm going to use that alongside some Japanese preparations. As for the Japanese influence, I was very interested in Japanese techniques from quite early in my cooking career, especially for things like making stocks and intensifying savoury flavours, particularly because I felt those aligned quite naturally with plant-based cooking. Then, as a young cook, I went out and visited Tokyo, only for a couple of weeks, but it had a big influence on me, and it really cemented my love of Japanese food and the aesthetics around it, as well as getting me more into using things like miso and seaweed in my cooking. And this recipe is a good example of how those influences fuse together with wild ingredients and historic dishes to create something quite interesting, I hope. So first we need to collect our nettles that we'll be using in a couple of ways in the dish. Dried for a cold brew dashi stock, and then cooked to use in the actual soup itself too. You can get nettles most of the year round in the UK, but the best time ideally is the spring, where there's new growth and young tender leaves. You want to pick nettles that look healthy and have nice rich green colours. Try and find areas that are away from dog walkers and the public, and pick the top third of the nettles or so, looking for newer growth and nettles that haven't yet gone to flower. Again, as with all foraging, do respect the area and the nature that you're in, and try not to take too much from any one place, even though nettles are admittedly pretty abundant. Obviously nettles can and will sting you until they've been prepared, so you're going to want to wear long sleeves and gloves when you're picking these. Now we can process our nettles for the next step. So first we'll strip the leaves from the stems, wearing our gloves, and then we're going to wash the leaves well. Now I want to dry some of these to use to make my dashi stock, and then some are going to be blanched to use in the soup itself. To dry the nettles, I place them in a dehydrator overnight at 35 degrees, or if you don't have one, you could leave them on the stems and just hang them to slowly dry. They'll lose their sting during this drying process, and then you can store them to use whenever you want. The nettles that I'm going to cook with, I'm going to first blanch in rapidly boiling water for about a minute, and then place them into cold water to stop the cooking. Then I'm going to let them strain and press out any excess water. We'll add these into the soup at the end of its cooking, just before it's blended, but if you wanted to store these, then at this stage you could actually bundle them up and put them into Ziploc bags and store them in the freezer like spinach. I'm going to use mine right away, but you might want to store some like this if you've collected extra and you want to save some for the future. Now we can make the first of two different stocks that we're going to use for this soup, a cold infused Nettle Dashi. I've spoken before about the fact that I like making cold infused dashis because you get a really clean, clear flavour and great umami extraction from the seaweed. Here, because I'm using my dried nettles in the dashi, I'm also getting their flavour and the phenolic compounds from the nettles, which help to augment that umami from the seaweed. And this is really simple to make. We're just going to combine our dried nettles, our kombu and cold water, and let that cold infuse overnight. And I'll leave all the details and the full recipe down in the description. There's a subtle flavour to this stock, and it's something you might want to try even if you don't make the full nettle soup. Next, I want to make the other stock that I use in this soup, which is a hemp miso stock. Now, I make my own hemp miso, and that flavour does work particularly well for this dish, but you could just use a store-bought white miso if you want to make a simpler version. If you do want to learn about making your own misos though, I have a video all about that, and I'll leave a link to that as well as the recipe for this one down in the description. This is a relatively short fermented miso at just 6 weeks, and I tend to do smaller batches of it in vacuum bags for this reason, although you could easily make a full jar of this too. To make my stock with this miso, I simply bring water to the boil, then turn off the heat and add my onions, garlic, lemon zest, and then my hemp miso or white miso if that's what you're using. Then I just let the stock cool and infuse before straining it. Preparing the soup itself is actually really simple, so I'll show you that, and then afterwards I'll show you the more interesting finishing touches. So I'm just going to gently fry off some onion and garlic, and then I'll add some of my nettle dashi and my hemp miso stock. And again, all the amounts are going to be down in the description. Once this comes to a simmer, I add in my lemon zest and juice, and then I can add in my blanched nettles. You could also add another leafy green in here like kale or spring greens if you wanted to replace some or all of the nettles, and you'll still get that umami boosting effect from the nettle dashi. I'll season the soup with some kelp powder and then it's ready to blend. Once the soup is blended smooth, it'll get a last little seasoning to taste. And then when I serve this, I place a few small meaty cooked marinated pieces of tofu in the bottom of the bowl. For these, I fry the tofu first before soaking it in a simple marinade, and I've spoken about and made a video about this technique before. It's very simple and effective. Here, that just gives a little extra texture and dimension to the soup. I drizzle the finished soup with a little bit of nettle oil. I've got a video about how I make my herb oils too, so I'll link that down in the description as well. And then our last element is our nitrogen frozen pine smoked whipped cream. I actually use an oat cream for this because I think its flavour works well here, and it's also nice that all of my guests can have this dish exactly as it is, whether they're vegan or not. So I smoke my oat cream over burning pine branches, and then it's whipped before being frozen in liquid nitrogen and then broken into smaller pieces. I can hold this smoked cream in the freezer now until I'm ready to serve it. Then once I've served the dish and explained it to my guests, I'll go round the tables and just finish the dish off with a little bit of that frozen pine smoked cream. You get this great smoke effect from the contrast between the hot soup and the frozen cream, and that also carries the aromas of the smoke as well as kind of giving you this visual clue towards the flavours of the dish. It's a really fun dish to serve and share with people, and it's one that always gets a really great reaction. And all that hidden work with the stocks and the flavour development means that you get this really delicious soup with the flavour of nettles and its own personality, but not quite what people would initially think of when they imagine a nettle soup. And that's the joy of a dish like this to me. It's delicious and memorable, but it also hopefully gets people thinking about nature and some of the wild foods around them in a different way. There's all these fantastic plants and flavourful ingredients around us, and many of them we just consider to be weeds. So I hope that's been interesting, and I think maybe we'll come back to the science around umami and this synergy effect in the future. I'll also try and get Miles Irving on here at some point if I can, because he's really interesting and just such an incredible expert on wild food. So until then, thanks for watching and I'll see you soon.